The intent of this session, Simon, is mainly, look, I mean, there's a group of, I mean, like I've told you before, I mean, there's a group of tennis players, and as every tennis player, not everybody is fortunate to have a dedicated physio, but some of us would like to, avail your services. I do avail your services very often, and I've benefited immensely. I thought, I'll share this with the entire group as well, and that's where we are here. And thank you for taking the time out, right?
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So just a quick introduction, folks. Simon has more than 25 years of experience in physiotherapy, and he has all the necessary qualifications, which you can see on the website that I've shared with you guys on Orthomed Physio. He's been a consultant physiotherapist with Netball Singapore for more than 10 years, and a very, very knowledgeable person in this domain, right? And I can speak from personal experience because Simon has, in a way, been a family physio, I would say, right? He has helped my wife with her knee and me with my back and my knee as well, right? Two main differences that I see, between Simon and other physios, because I've been to other physios also, is, Simon's main focus is, on strengthening and, and speeding up the recovery process versus, other physios who actually focus on rest and, and delay the recovery process, in my opinion, right? And second is, surgery avoidance, right? I mean, I went to Simon with my back when, some doctors told me, okay, go for back surgery. I went with my knee when some doctors told me, go for knee surgery. But Simon was like, no, you don't need to go through any surgery. Strengthen it and you see the benefits, right? And, I'm glad that, I have benefited from this and I've not gone under the knife yet, and I don't think I will go under the knife. And I'm glad that Simon is, is getting associated with 9Tennis family. And so that, we all can benefit from his, experience and wisdom, right? So Simon, I'll hand over the floor to you. And, I'll let you decide how you want to run this because you have the questions. And
sure.
Over to you, Simon. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kailash, and thanks for the opportunity to have a quick chat. Look, I guess probably the most important thing in talking to you guys today is obviously your tennis players, and it's looking at trying to not just reduce the likelihood of injury, but also increase performance. I guess probably when we, again, look at, say, any sport, when I first look at, I'm interested in looking at any specific sports, I'll oftentimes go through and have a look at what are some of the major injuries in that specific sport. And that helps us dictate how to try and reduce injury. And, when we look at, say, a sport like tennis, there's things like, obviously, tennis elbow problems, neck problems, shoulder problems, Achilles. These are sort of some of the major things we look at. And I guess when I join any team, so be it a basketball team, first thing I'm probably interested in is what's the thing that tends to affect what are the things we tend to see most of the injuries associated with? And so, as I said, certainly from tennis, and you guys probably know more than myself, obviously tennis elbow, we don't generally tend to see it associated with a lot of tennis, to be honest with you, but it's something that comes up regularly. I'd have to say in this sort of age group, it's rotator cuff, shoulder problems, lower backs are not uncommon, and then knee problems, and then ankle sprains are probably the most likely things. Again, we don't tend to see trauma from tennis, not like in rugby and so forth. So we can go through a few of those specific injuries and how we look at preventing them.
Simon, you lost your audio, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So just like, so that, sorry, there just seems to be some headphones. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So look, I think some of the myths that I think we need to break down to start with really simple. Number one, static stretching. The static stretching reduces the incidence of injury in most sports. And what we mean by that is before you do a sport, when you go through and do a static stretch, can we stretch things to help reduce injury, be it in tennis, rugby, running? And the data really suggests categorically that static stretching pre-sport probably doesn't reduce injury. There's been a couple of very good studies done in the world, 1998, with about 700 subjects where they put them into two groups. One group statically stretched, the other group didn't do any stretching. This was in an army recruitment situation, a boot camp, and they followed them for about 9 weeks. they found that static stretching didn't reduce any sort of lower limb injuries. It's repeated in 2002, static stretching, and they went through and looked at static stretching but stretching not just a hamstring, calf, quad, all of the lower limb muscles, and again made no difference to injury prevention. So I think the first thing that we probably need to sort of bury to start with, and that is static stretching is useful in reducing injuries. Why do I say that? Is because you'll see a lot of people still doing a lot of static stretching before they start sport. And in fact, we don't think it makes much difference. When you look at Nadal at the Australian Open or these guys, watch how, look at them and see, or even the Wallabies rugby union team, the Lions and rugby, Usain Bolt running the 100. Do you see them statically stretching before they run a race or what have you? Absolutely never. Rarely do we see that, because it actually doesn't reduce injury, number one. Number two, static stretching, we unfortunately think if you do static stretching before you do an activity, you actually reduce your performance. So in actual fact, there's some very good research, again, some of it produced by a colleague of mine back in Australia, looking at the effect of static stretching on sprint times. And in fact, there's been good data to suggest if you statically stretch and run over 40 meters, you reduce your sprint times by about a second. It's the same with Usain Bolt. He won't statically stretch before the 100 final because he'll run in that race probably a second less if he statically stretches. So we know static stretching also reduces jump for height or jump for distance. So if you're a tennis player, you want to be able to jump a good distance and not have that reduced by statically stretching before. So I think we can sort of throw out the window a little bit that the static stretching aspect of things is something that actually reduces injury and helps performance. And we'd actually argue and say the static stretching probably reduces performance and does not reduce injury. So that's the first thing. I wouldn't waste your time in statically stretching before. When you actually look at what most tennis players do, and obviously you go through and hit balls up and down the court, and you usually do a warm-up that normally goes for anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes. In actual fact, the data suggests that a warm-up, when you're doing warm-up drills, it's probably one of the most, it's the most useful way in reducing injuries. And so what you do anyway is quite useful: forehands, backhands, volleys, serves, smashes, perfect. The only thing I may suggest is that before you actually go through and do your warm-up, that you might do a dynamic stretching type of program before. And what I mean by that, it may be going through and doing some shuttle runs, running forwards to the net, accelerating, running backwards, because this is the sort of stuff you're going to do on a tennis court. And it may be that before you go onto the court and before you start hitting some balls, you'll go through and do some warm-up drills, running forward, running backwards, repeating that 5 times. It may be some quick sideways movements to get a little bit turning on the brain and so forth for sideways movements. In fact, the other thing that we think is quite useful, and just to warm the muscles up quickly before without the static stretching, is dynamic stretching. So dynamic stretching meaning that we might go through and do some high kicks. So the normal thing where you'll see people go through and dynamic hamstring stretching. When we look at quad stretching, we may go through and get people to go through. Can you see that? So it's more of so going up the court, doing something in this position. We may get, we often will get athletes to go through and do running along and jumps. So just to start getting the muscles turn on before we go through and do our warm up. In fact, we go through and do, so certainly in tennis, but also things like baseball, netball and basketball, sideways jumping. So in actual fact, quite dynamic things, be it running back and forwards, dynamic stretching, static stretching, going through and doing those sort of warm-up things seems to be specifically useful in just turning on the neuromuscular system. There's good data to suggest that actually works really quite well. We know that we know that actually doing a warm-up that lasts probably for more than about 10 minutes is probably useful. And you guys tend to do that in tennis. So first of all, take-home message is we generally wouldn't statically stretch. We do a warm-up. Oh, sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Camus?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry. So doing a dynamic stretching program, no static stretching, and a warm up is quite good. Now, after you finish tennis, again, static stretching has been shown not to reduce delayed onset muscle soreness. So when you finished a match, again, be it in rugby, tennis, or what have you, these guys, when they finish the match, they don't go back and do a stretching program. And in fact, we know that it's somewhat of a waste of time. It's not going to reduce what we call delayed onset muscle soreness or pain 2 days later. It makes no difference. Unfortunately, once you've done a heavy exercise, like you've done a heavy thing in the gym, bicep curls or what have you, you're always going to get some pain 2 days later, whether you stretch it or not stretch it. It makes no difference. You've already done the damage. So static stretching post makes no difference. A warm down afterwards. So you see players, once they're finished, would you see them walk up and down the court, do some dynamic things? A total waste of time. Post-match warm down makes no difference. People use the sort of thing of saying, oh, well, it helps flush lactic acid out of the body. Lactic acid is flushed out of the body automatically within 35 to 40 minutes, regardless of whether we stand on our head or sit down in the corner. It makes no difference what we do. So the only time we may do a warm down to flush lactic acid out quicker is if we've got to get back and do another heat in swimming or play another quick match, and we might do that, but rarely do we worry. There's good data to suggest that dynamic stretching makes no difference. Warm down makes no difference after, or static stretching. Post exercise, what's the most useful thing generally? Interestingly, we would suggest obviously a high carbohydrate intake, as well as high carbohydrate protein. Interestingly, caffeine seems to help carbohydrate absorption. So when you drink Gatorade and stuff, a lot of these actually are laced a bit with caffeine and so forth as well. So getting some food and stuff into you within 20 minutes of the activity seems to be helpful. And then ice baths, but most of us don't have access to those. So again, it's in a really simple way. A lot of the stuff we probably do afterwards, be it in that sort of routine, probably doesn't help too much in reducing the likelihood of injuries and so forth, and it doesn't really affect our recovery. Now, I guess some of the other questions were put forward by me, so hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. And just looking at when we would do what particular things we do to reduce sort of injury. Things like, so if we looked at some of the major things in regards to tennis and obviously injuries that are associated specifically with tennis, I'll go to some simple things. So even things like wrist pain and elbow pain, there's no doubt that obviously a change of things like poundage in the racket, so in the strings, if you go from a low poundage to a high poundage, that can have an effect obviously on things like wrists and on things like tennis elbow things. So being a little bit careful when you've gone to a new racket, that instead of going and using a new racket for 3 matches in a row, that it might be something you train with it and use for part of the session and just start getting used to it. Because that's to do with not just the poundage on the racket, but also the size of the grip can also have an effect. So if you're going to go through and use a racket, our suggestion will be is that you actually go through and don't use that racket or what have you for too long in a session, but short sessions. We look at specific injuries. So for me, in a nutshell, in preventing tennis-related injuries or injuries with any sport, without a doubt, the most important aspect is strength. And if we see the biggest change, say in the last 30 or 40 years, when you look at any elite tennis players or rugby or what have you, and tennis is a great example, where you look at somebody like one of the first athletes in tennis, or some of the early athletes in tennis to start really going to the gym and doing a lot of strengthening, Martina Navratilova. This is a person in the 80s who was criticised because she was quite big and muscly, but in fact had a very long career and still won Wimbledon, I think, in mixed doubles at 50 years of age, because she was strong. She spent a lot of time in the gym. And so getting stronger reduces injuries. And I don't need to be a rocket scientist, but we definitely know that getting stronger, be it in the wrist or being in the shoulders, obviously helps reduce injuries. We definitely know when we look at a few specific injuries like wrist pain or elbow pain, for me, they're not complicated exercises that you have to do, but we may go through, and let me show you a few of them. So we go through, from an elbow perspective, rarely in most wrist problems and elbow problems, getting patients to, I'm using just an umbrella, but going through and doing fairly high rotation exercise to strengthen the rotation muscles often is a good way of reducing elbow problems, wrist problems. We oftentimes go through and we can use some elastic like I've got here and wrist strengthening. So from a wrist perspective, if you want exercises that are going to reduce the incidence of elbow or wrist problems, this is just elastic going through and doing a lot of elastic strengthening for the wrist, and in a really simple way going through and doing umbrella type exercises are particularly useful. When we look at the shoulder, so there's simple wrist and elbow problems that people get. The shoulder and the shoulder joint is probably the most common joint we see in tennis, where people get what we call an impingement in the shoulder. And a subacromial impingement basically is have a ball and socket joint. I'll get a model and show you. And in a shoulder, this is a shoulder joint, an impingement problem, the shoulder jams into the top part here and you get pain radiating down through here. In a really simple way, the most important part of preventing this isn't so much stretching and strengthening, but it's making the muscles around the shoulder stronger. And this is where you see a lot of people in the gym doing a lot of the rotation with elastic exercises to hold the ball in the socket. And you'll see them doing it with elastic like so. We also get our athletes to go through and spend a lot of time doing upper back strengthening as well to hold the shoulders in a retracted position. And we know that this reduces the amount of impingement in the shoulder. Interestingly, we don't think that static stretching around the shoulder, most people don't get particularly tight around the shoulder. It's usually an irritation and impingement, and that's due to a lack of strength. So shoulder injury is quite common. And again, coming back to a decent strengthening program, things like lower back issues, and most people who have lower back pain, athletes and so forth, this is not just muscle pain. It's usually the discs in between and disc pain. And disc pain is a common thing we see obviously these days, not just obviously in the sportsmen, but just because of the amount of time people are sitting in front of PCs. So again, if tennis players are getting pain in their lower back, it's not just coming from most likely playing tennis, but most of the time it's probably sitting posture position. And so getting good ergonomic assessment, so getting somebody, the wife or somebody at home, to take pictures of how you sit, your ergonomic setup, to see that you're not slumping, you have a good support in the lower back. And I would be suggesting for most people these days who are sitting at home a lot that they use some sort of standing desk for at least 2 hours or so during the day, so they're not putting pressure on the disc, because it's the disc usually that has much more pressure from sitting. But again, from a lower back perspective, going through and using core stability exercises can often be quite useful. Again, ankle sprains are quite common in tennis, and we definitely know that going through and strengthening the calf as well as glute strengthening can be useful. Some people like to use braces or tapes that can also be quite useful. So there's obviously lots of different injuries that you can get from tennis. I guess I put it out there. Is there any sort of specific questions people have in regards to tennis related injuries that are specific to them, or questions that they have?
Yeah, no, I think this really helps. I mean, at least specifically, I didn't know the difference between dynamic stretching and static stretching, right? So I think that that's something really useful.
Look, I think in a nutshell, it's interesting in tennis. I think tennis, when you look at injury prevention, is a sport that actually is quite structured in that, because you do your warm up things and you build it up nice and slowly. All warm up is doing is just turning on the brain to get the muscles to work. That's all warm up drills are. The only thing I might suggest to people is that they may make it a little bit structured, perhaps, and do a few more sprints backwards and forwards before you start, sideways, some jumps. So some jumps, be it on the spot, quite high jumps, explosive jumps, sideways jumps, single leg jump from side to side, where you're basically, again, going from a side to side on one leg, can also be quite useful. But so a dynamic aspect, a little bit more of a functional running aspect, and then do your normal 10-minute warm-up is perfect. And dump all the static stretching afterwards, as well as warm down and so forth. But probably the big thing from my perspective, from an injury prevention perspective, is gym. It's getting in and doing exercise. And we've spoken about shoulders, so a good shoulder rotator, cuff strengthening program. When it comes to shoulders, just a couple of quick things just for the weekend warriors who go to the gym. We spoke about the impingement problem, the jamming of this into the top that produces oftentimes what we call a rotator cuff tendinopathy. But there's probably 5 exercises, if people do go to the gym, that will increase the likelihood of that impingement problem in the shoulder. Military press above shoulder height, we prefer people probably not to do as much. The lat pull down behind the head oftentimes jams the shoulder. So we would suggest, if you're going to the gym and instead of doing a military press, we would suggest that you do a high incline press. So go lie down or go up more into an incline position like so, rather than this position are associated with these shoulder problems. Doing a lat pull down instead of the lat pull down behind the head, doing a closed grip lat pull down instead of doing the dips that a lot of people do when they go in, and you'll see them do dips, jams into the shoulder. That's triceps. We'll get you into a tricep pull down instead of doing things like push-ups, jams the shoulder, which again is a tricep, to a different tricep pull down. So again, and then a pull-up exercise tends to jam. So things like pull-ups, push-ups, bent over rows, dips, lat pull down, and military press increase the likelihood of shoulder problems and neck problems. And we'd say probably suggest that people will spend less time doing it, because a lot of people go to the gym and they present with pain like this and they go and play tennis. It makes it worse. So stop those things in the gym and replace them. And then the other thing when we're talking about shoulders, and that is, if you start getting pain in the front part of the shoulder here, it's not the muscle, like it's not the deltoid muscle here, it's in the joint. And if you're over the age of 30 and you get pain here, this is a subacromial impingement without me even looking at it. It's not just a little deltoid strain. And in that situation, if it's not going away, it's not a little muscle strain. It's usually, again, this type of impingement we showed about. You did need to do something with it, either seek treatment or modify what you're doing. And oftentimes it can be as simple as stuff you're doing in the gym. But the other thing is also start some strengthening that can also avoid it. And then the final thing is have a look at when the pain comes on. So if you're a tennis player, and certainly with the tennis players we've seen, I always get the shoulder pain when I'm serving. Either stop serving and give it a bit of a break and don't do lots of practice with serving, or change your serve to have much more of a kick side type serve. So it's not the sort of heavy over the top of your bundle end or serve, but it's more of a side type of spin slice serve. And that can oftentimes take some of the pressure off that. Any other specific questions you sort of related to tennis related problems?
Yeah, I think this has been really really good, Simon. I think I just have one question that is coming in. It is like, what is the main cause of tennis elbow? Is it the wrong racket, playing technique, or body strength?
Yeah, it's a good question. So look, tennis elbow. So basically, when you see me move my fingers, and you can see the tendons go up here and insert into the side of the bone here. Now, people used to think that tennis elbow was a tendonitis, and in fact, it's not a tendonitis. It's a tendinopathy, or a degeneration of the tendon. You get that with your Achilles. And in actual fact, it's not inflammation. So often in the past, people would think, we just rest it and the pain goes. The tendon actually becomes degenerative. And when the tendon becomes degenerative, you lose some of the collagen. There's no inflammation. And it actually starts to degenerate. Like a joint degenerates, it becomes arthritic. And instead of having nice collagen all in a line, you tend to get bits, you get a reduction in the collagen, and it's all a bit disorganized. And most often it comes on, it's somewhat age related. So this oftentimes happens because it's starting to degenerate, like with age and in your 30s and so forth. It's usually due to an overload. So when you're saying what's the cause, it's almost always due to an increase in load that's too quick. Now that could be from playing too much tennis, number one. It could, and that's probably the most likely thing. Number two, poor technique. So again, if someone comes in and they say, I'm getting tennis elbow, and I watch how they hit a backhand, and they hit a backhand like this, rather than using their full body weight to produce the momentum, probably the best place to start is get them to go and see a tennis coach and learn how to hit a backhand, to be honest, rather than try and treat the cause of the problem. Sorry, try and treat not the cause of the problem, but actually the symptom. So I think the thing with tennis elbow, usually it's an increase in load that's too quick. So firstly, just stop whatever you're doing that's making it worse. So it may be obviously just hitting backhand. So play on the forehand court in the interim. Number two, the use of tennis elbow braces is fairly ineffective. We know that it probably reduces the force through the elbow at 10%. It generally doesn't seem to help. It's a degenerative condition, and interestingly, resting it makes it worse. So our suggestion is, we showed you before, using things, going through and strengthening it, we seem to think helps. So going through and doing rotation strengthening and doing this for 4 minutes increases the strength around the elbow with the rotation muscles. And we know that loading the muscles seems to heal it. And then we do things with the elastic and holding it here and so forth. So the take-home message with tennis elbow or any tendonitis or tendinopathy is actually strength. Now, the problem with strengthening that you have to do is that it will take you 3 months. It's not quick. So in the past, traditionally, people get very frustrated. They start a bit of physio. 2 weeks later, it's no better, and it's not going to be better. Traditionally, I'll review lots of patients who've seen lots of different physios, and it's like, oh, I did this for 3 weeks. It was no different. They just need to continue to strengthen it. And what we would say with a strengthening program, like with this one, is be consistent for 8 to 12 weeks, and they get better. So tennis elbow is due to an overload, but in fact, by resting will make it worse. Rest it from the high load activities. What I mean by that is the jarring of the tennis or things like that. But you need to go into a strengthening program. You do that for an 8-week period, and 80% of them get better. Things like acupuncture, shockwave therapy. In fact, steroid injections have been shown to help in the short term, but make it worse later on, because they're injected in corticosteroid, which gets rid of the inflammation. But in fact, these aren't inflamed. There's no inflammation. In fact, it's just degeneration. Interestingly, with the tendon, people think it's a lack of blood supply. And in actual fact, it's an increase in blood supply. You actually have an increase in vascularity, like the little veins you see on your leg, the little capillaries here. That's what happens in the tendon, and that's what makes it painful. So take-home message with tennis elbow, Achilles tendinopathy, the big take-home message is do progressive strengthening. And often, if it's an Achilles problem and it's just lots of calf raises, if it's a tennis elbow problem, load the tendon progressively, but consistently 5 to 6, 7 minutes a day, and go through and do that for 8 weeks, and they all get better. Imaging, waste of time. So there's good data to suggest that going through and doing an MRI or doing an ultrasound doesn't give us much information on how bad it is or how to treat it. So strengthening and give it the right amount of time. And there's a lot of other Tom quackery out there in regards to be it shockwave and all these other bits and pieces. And in fact, it's been shown to be pretty much a waste of time. But obviously in that period, you also need to take away the high load activity. So if it's an Achilles problem in your Achilles, you don't want to be marathon running. You've got to back off the running. If you're playing tennis, look at a way to reduce the amount of load. And when I have tennis players who've got acute elbow pain, I'll often say you've got to give it probably 6 weeks for acute, really aggressive strengthening. Once it's not painful, then you can ease yourself back into tennis slowly. But the other thing is, you said, what are the causes? Yeah, increase in load, grip size being too big. Essentially, when we talk about the tennis elbow situation, increase in load will be a cause. Secondly, obviously, grip size. And all I'm suggesting there is when you get transitioning to a different racket, don't go and spend 3 hours playing in an afternoon with the same grip size. Ease yourself in slowly so that you get used to it. And that's the same with the tension on the racket as well. They're probably, and also obviously the size of the racket head, it really means don't go through and kill yourself. It matches and get the new racket and go straight into it, but take your time adjusting. So they're probably the biggest things probably I would suggest insofar as looking at reducing the likelihood of tennis elbow problems and also how to reduce them.
Thanks, Simon. Simon, just one question over here. There was a question around what should be the optimal heart rate in a 2-hour game to avoid stressing out, right? Because I think now these days everybody uses an iWatch, or some watch to measure the heart rate, right? So I think this was one of the concerns, because sometimes we go very aggressive and we don't know where to stop or where to draw the line.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is, I think the one thing about heart rate in a match anyway is variable on the individual. And so again, what would be, the maximum? Definitely when you're exercising at a high intensity, anything above, high intensity exercise is anything above probably the 150 marked up to 160 or 70 is pretty high intensity heart rate pace. Look, I think probably from my sort of perspective, if you're looking at particular values, it's going to obviously peak when you're hitting balls, et cetera, et cetera. I think probably the biggest concern with me when you're looking at heart rates through matches is how quickly you're able to get it back down to a reasonable level. Like if you have a rally and hit 10 balls, and you look at the data afterwards, and you're able to look at it at a time sort of thing, and it's taking you in between points. You've got 30 seconds between a point, or a minute between a point, and the heart rate's not even getting back down to the right level. When you're looking from a sports medicine sort of perspective or an aerobic perspective, that's probably of concern, because your heart rate's never getting back down to a resting sort of level or lower sort of level. So I think if you're looking at any of the data, looking at heart rate, I'd be obviously interested to see obviously what levels you go to, but probably how quickly you're able to get back down to, you're able to recover in between points is probably a better indication. Because look, going through and doing high intensity exercise, of course, it's going to go into a high level. That's what the heart does. It pumps blood around. But probably a better indication of how fit you are on your recovery is and the recovery is how quickly you can get back down to a base level. And most people's base level heart rates in exercise, normal resting heart rate is about 70 beats a minute. After you've done high intensity, it'll peak probably at about a 150, 160. And we'd be hoping in between points, does your heart rate rapidly get down? And if you're a person where the heart rate just stays at, 100 and, at 100 or 95 to 100, never has a recovery, it probably, if anything, is an indication that you probably need to be a bit fitter, I would be suggesting. So it's not my area, certainly expertise, but most of the time when you're looking at fitness of people, it's rate of recovery. And if it's not getting down to a lower sort of level, then we would be suggesting that that's probably something that would be of concern. It's the quickness of recovery. The quickness of recovery is probably the best indication of if you're a reasonably fit person. And obviously, getting levels, heart rate levels that are just exorbitant, probably isn't a good indication of the amount of pressure that's being put on the heart. Obviously, the other big parameters, let's face it, the big things most physicians and so forth are interested in is what the blood pressure goes up to when you're playing. And that's almost impossible. You're not going to be monitoring that throughout the match.
Right.
But, yeah.
Right. So I think is this somebody's asking, is it 220 minus age at thumb rule? Is that some thumb rule like that if it is 220 minus your age?
So what they look at, there's different, what they're actually looking at is when they're looking at those particulars, lots of different equations for looking at optimal heart rate or maximum heart rate through exercise. And one of them is 220 minus age. And they're looking here at what are the levels of exercise that give us cardiovascular gain. So there's different ways of working it out. So those formulas are just determining not what your maximum heart rate should be, but what is the preferred heart rate when you're doing exercise to be able to get a cardiovascular benefit.
Right.
And generally speaking, these equations all come out with about the same output, and that is that if you wanted to get benefit from playing tennis and cardiovascular benefit, so that's not looking at what you should be exercising at. What that's looking at is what is on average the heart rate that we should be exercising at to get a cardiovascular benefit. So that's not giving me what my maximum heart rate should be. It's really interesting. We look at the 220 minus age and a few different parameters. Generally, when you look at these right across the board, whether you're a 95-year-old or whether you're a 12-year-old, and when they're working out these optimal heart rate levels to get benefit from doing cardiovascular exercise. In fact, regardless of age and regardless of resting heart rate, they always come out to be around about the same. They're about 150 to 160. So I oftentimes have patients who come in here and it's like, okay, we want you to be exercising at a particular optimal level for a certain amount of time to be able to burn calories and lose weight. And so we'll work out, so you need to be exercising at 155. In fact, when you go through and you work it out for age of the individual, as well as their resting heart rate, they're always around about the same. So that equation is actually more about what is the optimal heart rate to be exercising at to get cardiovascular gain. But when you're sort of asking me, the other question was really about what is the optimal heart rate to be exercising at in tennis. It depends what your resting heart rate is. Everybody's quite variable. You've got some people have a very low resting heart rate, and so for them, but again, as I said before, I don't think it's what the heart rate generally goes up to. I think it's, for me, a reflection of how fit you are is more about the fact of how quickly it comes back down to the resting level in between points, so the recovery level. And you see it when you play with people. You've got people who are really unfit and they'll hit 4 or 5 shots and they get back into the ready position and they're puffing and panting, probably an indication. And that's mainly because, their recovery is not taking, 10 seconds, it's taking 40 seconds, a minute for them to get back to a reasonable sort of heart rate level.
Got it. Just one last question, Simon, before we let you go. Is there any way to kind of maintain the energy levels during a 2 to 3 hour game? I mean, what would you suggest in terms of, is there any diet or do you think that we could follow?
I think from a very generic sort of perspective, obviously playing in the conditions in Singapore, without a doubt, its hydration levels are probably the most important thing. There's no doubt if you're playing extended matches, so good hydration levels are probably the most important thing, mainly because you're sweating a lot, and especially in this sort of temperature. Secondly, obviously, when you're playing throughout a day, and you definitely see it when you watch professional tennis players and so forth, they're usually eating through a match, interesting. So you'll see these guys oftentimes having high carb, high protein types of snacks that are quickly absorbable. The reason you tend to be eating through a match, and we're talking about things that are easily digestible and so forth, is mainly because by using carb, interestingly, carbohydrate protein is a synergist to help carbohydrate absorption. So oftentimes the use of protein in combination with carb, as well as things like caffeine, interestingly, seem to help carbohydrate absorption. But the advantage of using them through exercise is that usually it can be converted into what we call glycogen and high energy things throughout the match. So if there's probably a piece of advice that I would sort of suggest in that is, certainly if you're playing for extended periods, it's just to continue to eat small amounts of food, especially if you're playing for 2 or 3 hours. You might play for 2 hours on a weekend or what have you. Again, having, obviously good hydration, but also eating small amounts of high energy food can oftentimes be obviously quite useful as well. And again, as I said before, using it then afterwards. And also pre-match loading, certainly from an athlete perspective in the elite sport I've been involved in, we have a pre-match snack usually, so something quite before. And interestingly, it can oftentimes involve carb, protein, caffeine before. People think caffeine's really bad. It's interesting. And they say, mate, it's a diuretic. What they keep forgetting to mention is that when you're exercising, no blood goes to the kidneys. The kidneys is what flushes the blood and makes us pee, basically. And so you can drink a shitload of coffee actually when you're playing, and it's not going to make a difference. It's not actually acting as a diuretic because the filtration system, the kidney system, is turned off. And essentially, it's just going all to the muscle. So caffeine actually is used a lot by athletes, and we think it actually, we advocate huge amounts of it, but a lot of athletes tend to like it because it increases reaction times, but it actually is a synergist actually for carbohydrate absorption. So good hydration obviously is important. Hydration is particularly important because we know that people who are dehydrated lose 2 things: peripheral vision. So they've done lots of tests before where they've dehydrated people and they'll get them to look and see when they lose. And so peripheral vision is always lost much earlier with dehydration. And obviously reaction times. The 2 things you need when you're playing any sort of sport. So hydration. And then obviously if you can just keep things obviously insofar as built up insofar as food and so forth, but small amounts of food before, during, and afterwards is particularly useful.
Yeah, all right. So I think with that, Simon, I think we'll close the session. Thank you for spending the time. I think it's been more than 45
My
minutes.
pleasure. Anyway, hopefully it might be a bit useful. And again, to all of your fellows, if there's any questions, I think that Cameron's just got my WhatsApp, and more than happy to flick me any questions or concerns. Look, a lot of the time when it comes to be it sports medicine or injuries or what have you, I'd say a lot of the patients I talk to, I don't even see them. They just send me a message and say, hang on, what do you think I should do? I have this. And a lot of the time, what we try and do, I guess over my 30 years, is I'm more than happy to give whatever advice I can give. And a lot of the time, it's not even treatment. A lot of the time is actually, look, if you need to go and see a specialist, see this specialist, because this specialist is going to do the right surgery and not operate on you. Or if you have a lower back problem, lose weight, maintain exercise, stop smoking, and do a core stability program. A lot of the time, the information that we give out is fairly sensible and logical. And in fact, a lot of it's not very sexy, but in fact, it's scientifically proven, because most of the stuff that we hopefully do, whether it's in sports medicine or in sports performance, should be based on evidence. When you're looking at COVID and stuff, you don't just listen to Donald Trump, you listen to Anthony Fauci, evidence-based stuff. And so sometimes that's a bit tough to find, but certainly any questions you've got, more than happy to help you with.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Simon, and we'll let you go.
Nice with it. And look after yourself. Good to see you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye for now.